Where did I know? So slow.
Hi, I'm Max, and right now I'm reading The Adventures of Captain Underpants. Meet George Beard and Harold Hutchins. George is the kid on the left with the tie and the flat top. Harold is the one on the right with the t-shirt and the bad haircut. Remember that now. Flower shop, pick your own roses. George and Harold were best friends. They had a lot in common. They lived right next door to each other, and they were both in the same fourth grade class at Jerome Horwitz Elementary School. George and Harold were usually responsible kids. Whenever anything bad happened, George and Harold were usually responsible. But don't get the wrong idea about these two. George and Harold were actually very nice boys. No matter what anybody else thought, they were good, sweet, and lovable. Well, okay, maybe they weren't so sweet and lovable, but they were good nonetheless. It's just that George and Harold each had a silly streak a mile long. Usually that silly streak was hard to control, and sometimes it got them in trouble. Once it got them into big trouble. But before I can tell you that story, I have to tell you this story. After a hard day of cracking jokes, pulling pranks, and causing mayhem at school, George and Harold liked to rush to the old treehouse in George's backyard. Inside the treehouse were two big old fluffy chairs, a table, a cupboard crammed with junk food, and a padlock crate filled with pencils, pens, and stacks of paper. Now Harold loved to draw, and George loved to make up stories. And together the two boys spent hours and hours writing and drawing their very own comic books. Over the years, they had created hundreds of their own comics, starring dozens of their own superheroes. First there was Dogman, then came Timmy the Talking Toilet, and who could forget the Amazing Cow Lady? But the all-time greatest superhero they ever made up had to be the Amazing Captain Underpants. George came up with the idea. Most superheroes look like they're flying around in their underwear. He said, well, this guy actually is flying around in his underwear. The two boys laughed and laughed. Yeah, said Harold, he could fight with wedgie power. George and Harold spent entire afternoons writing and drawing the comic adventures of Captain Underpants. He was their coolest superhero ever. Luckily for the boys, the secretary at Jerome Horwitz Elementary School was much too busy to keep an eye on the copy machine, so whenever they got a chance, Harold and George would sneak off into the office and run off several hundred copies of their latest Captain Underpants adventure. After school, they sold their homemade comics on the playground for 5 cents each, or 50 cents each. The Really Cool Adventures of Captain Underpants, written by George Beard, drawn by Harold Hutchins. It was a time of darkness and despair for planet Earth. Bad guys had taken over the streets, and all of the superheroes in the world were too old to fight evil. Hey! Ha ha! Then along came a new, improved, extra-strength superhero. Tra-la-la! Look up in the sky. It's a bird. It's a plane. It's an egg salad sandwich. No way! I'm Captain Underpants. Captain Underpants was faster than a speeding waistband. Zoom. More powerful than boxer shorts, and able to leap tall buildings without getting a wedgie. Tra-la-la! Night and day, Captain Underpants watched over the city, fighting for truth, justice, and all that is pre-shunk and cottony. Meanwhile, at a nearby elementary school, it was Stinky Taco Surprise at the cafeteria. Yuck. Everyone hated it so much they threw it all away. Soon the cafeteria food came to life. I am the inedible hunk. The monster ran around the school, eating everything in sight. Munch. Help, the inedible hunk just ate up 15 folding chairs and the gym teacher. Oh no, not folding chairs. This looks like a job for tra-la-la, Captain Underpants. Captain Underpants shot lots of underwear at the monster, but it didn't do any good. Munch, zip, munch, munch. So Captain Underpants took off running. The inedible hunk chased after him. Grr, help! and chased him, and chased him. Finally, the inedible hunk got too tired and thirsty to chase Captain Underpants. How about a nice drink of water? So the monster took a long drink from a shiny white bowl when suddenly, flush, hooray for Captain Underpants! And so the inedible hunk got flushed away and was never heard from again. Tra-la-la! The end. Don't miss our next exciting adventure, Captain Underpants and the Attack of the Talking Toilets, coming soon to a playground near you. Did you see that old guy looking out the window up there? That's Mr. Krupp, the principal. Now, Mr. Krupp was the meanest, sourest old principal in the whole history of Jerome Horwitz Elementary School. He hated laughter and singing. He hated the sounds of children playing at recess. In fact, he hated children altogether. And guess which two children Mr. Krupp hated most of all? If you guessed George and Harold, you're right. Mr. Krupp hated George and Harold. He hated their pranks and their wisecracks. He hated their silly attitudes and their constant giggling. And he especially hated those awful Captain Underpants comic books. I'm going to get those boys one day, Mr. Krupp vowed. One day very, very soon. Remember that when I said George and Harold's silly streak got them into big, big trouble once? Well, this is how it happened, and how some huge pranks and a little bit blackmail turned their principal into the coolest superhero of all time. It was the day of the big football game between the Horwitz Knuckleheads and the Steubenville Stinkbugs. The bleachers were filled with fans. Jerome Horwitz Elementary, see our big football game today! The cheerleaders ran in the field and shook their pom-poms over their heads. Fine black dust drifted out of their pom-poms and settled all around them. "Give me a K," shouted the cheerleaders. "K," repeated the fans. "Give me an N," shouted the cheerleaders. "N," replied the fans. "Give me an ha-ha-ha-choo," sneezed the cheerleaders. "Ha-ha-choo," repeated the fans. The cheerleaders sneezed and sneezed and sneezed some more. They couldn't stop sneezing. "Hey," shouted a fan in the bleachers. "Someone sprinkled black pepper into the cheerleaders' pom-poms. I wonder who did that?" asked another fan. The cheerleaders stumbled off the field, sneezing and dripping with mucus, as the marching band members took their places. But when the band began to play, steady streams of bubbles began blowing out of their instruments. Bubbles were everywhere. Up and down the field, the marching band slipped and slid, leaving behind a thick trail of wet, bubbly foam. "Hey," shouted a fan in the bleachers, "someone poured bubble bath into the marching band's instruments. I wonder who did that?" asked another fan. Soon the football teams took up the field. The knuckleheads kicked the ball. Up, up, up went the ball. Higher and higher it went. The ball sailed into the clouds and kept right on going until no one could see it anymore. "Hey," shouted a fan in the bleachers, "someone filled the game ball with helium. I wonder who did that?" asked another fan. But the missing ball didn't make any difference, because at that moment the knuckleheads were rolling around in the field, scratching and itching like crazy. "Hey," shouted the coach, "someone replaced our deep-heating muscle rub lotion with Mr. Prankster's extra scratchy itching cream." "We wonder who did that," shouted the fans in the bleachers. The whole afternoon went on much the same way, with people shouting everything from, "Hey, someone put sea monkeys in the lemonade," to, "Hey, someone glued all the bathroom doors shut." Before long, most of the fans in the bleachers had gotten up and left. The big game had been forfeited, and everyone in the entire school was miserable. Jerome Horwitz Elementary. Boy, our feet smell bad. Everyone, that is, except for two giggling boys crouched in the shadows beneath the bleachers. "Those were our best pranks yet," laughed Harold. "Yep," chuckled George. "They'll be hard to top, that's for sure. I just hope we don't get busted for this." "Don't worry," said George. "We covered our tracks really well. There's no way we'll get busted." The next day at school, an announcement came over the loudspeakers. "George Beard and Harold Hutchins, please report to Principal Krupp's office at once." "Uh-oh, I don't like the sound of that." "Don't worry, they can't prove anything." George and Harold entered Principal Krupp's office and sat down on the chairs in front of the desk. The two boys had been in this office together countless times before, but this time was different. Mr. Krupp was smiling. As long as George and Harold had known Mr. Krupp, they had never, ever seen him smile. Mr. Krupp knew something. I didn't see you boys at the ball game yesterday. No, we weren't feeling well. Yeah, Harold stammered nervously. We went home. Aw, that's too bad, said Principal Krupp. You guys missed a good game. George and Harold quickly glanced at each other, gulped, and tried hard to look not guilty. Lucky for you, I have a videotape of the whole thing, Mr. Krupp said. He turned on the television in the corner and pressed the play button on the VCR. A black and white image appeared on the TV screen. It was an overhead shot of George and Harold sprinkling pepper into the cheerleaders' pom-poms. Next came a shot of George and Harold pouring liquid bubble bath into the marching band's instruments. How do you like the pre-game show? Asked Mr. Krupp with a devilish grin. George eyed the television screen in terror. He couldn't answer. Harold's eyes were glued to the floor. He couldn't look. The tape went on, revealing all of George and Harold's behind-the-scenes antics. By now, both boys were eyeing the floor, squirming nervously and dripping with sweat. Mr. Krupp turned off the TV. You know, he said, ever since you boys came to the school, it's been one prank after another. First, you put dissected frogs in the Jello salad at the parent-teacher banquet. Then you made it snow in the cafeteria. Then you rigged all the intercoms so they played Weird Al Yankovic songs full blast for 6 hours straight. For 4 long years you have been running amok in the school, and I've never been able to prove anything. Until now! Mr. Krupp held the videotape in his hands. I took the liberty of installing tiny video surveillance cameras all around the school. I knew I'd catch you two one day. I didn't know it would be so easy. Mr. Krupp sat in his chair and chuckled to himself for a long, long time. Finally, George got up the courage to speak. What are you going to do with that tape? He said. I thought you'd never asked, laughed Principal Krupp. I've thought long and hard about what to do with this tape. At first I thought I'd send copies to your parents. The boys swallowed hard and sank deeply into their chairs. Then I thought I might send a copy to the school board, Mr. Krupp continued. I could get you both expelled for this. The boys swallowed harder and sank deeper into their chairs. Finally I came to a decision. I think the football team would be very curious to find out who was responsible for yesterday's fiasco. I think I'll send a copy to them. George and Harold leapt out of their chairs and fell to their knees. No, cried George. You can't do that. They'll kill us. Yeah, begged Harold. They'll kill us every day for the rest of our lives. Mr. Krupp laughed and laughed. Please have mercy, the boys cried. We'll do anything. Anything? Asked Principal Krupp with delight. He reached into the desk, pulled out a list of demands, and tossed it at the boys. If you don't want to be dead as long as you live, you'll follow these rules exactly. Rules. Kneel here. George and Harold carefully looked over the list. This is blackmail, said George. Call it what you like, Principal Krupp snapped. But if you two don't follow that list exactly, when this tape becomes the property of Horwitz knuckleheads. Rules. Number 1. No more practical jokes or pranks. Number 2. No laughing or smiling. Number 3. No more... I can't read the rest. Okay. At 6 o'clock the next morning, George and Harold dragged themselves out of bed, walked over to Mr. Krupp's house, and began washing his car. Then, while Harold scrubbed the tires, George roamed around the yard, pulling up all the weeds and crabgrass he could find. Afterward, they cleaned the gutters and washed all the windows in Mr. Krupp's house. At school, George and Harold sat up straight, listened carefully, and spoke only when spoken to. They didn't tell jokes, they didn't pull pranks, they didn't even smile. Their teacher kept pinching himself. I just know this is a dream, she said. At lunch, the two boys vacuumed Mr. Krupp's office, shined his shoes, and polished his desktop. At recess, they clipped his fingernails and ironed his tie. Every spare moment in the boys' daily schedule was spent catering to Mr. Krupp's every whim. After school, George and Harold mowed Mr. Krupp's lawn, tended his garden, and began painting the front of his house. At sunset, Mr. Krupp came outside and handed each boy a stack of books. Gentlemen, he said, I've asked your teachers to give you both extra homework. Now go home, study hard, and I'll see you back here at 6 o'clock tomorrow morning. We've got a busy day ahead of us. Thank you, sir, moaned the two boys. George and Harold walked home dead tired. Man, this is the worst day of my entire life, said George. Don't worry, said Harold. We'll only have to do this for 8 more years. Then we can move away to some far-off land where they'll never find us. Maybe Antarctica. I've got a better idea, said George. Hey kids, it's the 3D Hypno Ring. Learn the art of hypnosis. Amaze your friends, control your enemies, rule the world. It's easy, it's fun. Only $2.99 plus $1.01 shipping and handling. Send check or money order to the. He took a piece of paper out of his pocket and handed it to Harold. It was an old magazine ad for the 3D Hypno Ring. How's this going to help us? Asked Harold. All we got to do is hypnotize Mr. Krupp, said George. We'll make him give us the video and forget this whole mess ever happened. That's a great idea, said Harold. And the best part is we only have to wait 4 to 6 weeks for delivery. After 4 to 6 weeks of back-breaking slave labor, grueling homework assignments, and humiliating good behavior at school, a package arrived in George's mailbox from the Little Wise Guy Novelty Company. It was the 3D Hypno Ring! Hallelujah! cried George. It's everything I ever hoped for. Let me see it. Let me see it. Don't look directly at it, warned George. You don't want to get hypnotized, do you? Do you really think it'll work? Asked Harold. Do you really think we can amaze our friends, control our enemies, and take over the world just like that ad says? Better work, said George, or else we just waited 4 whole bucks. The 3D Hypno Ring. The next morning, George and Harold didn't arrive early at Mr. Krupp's house to wash his car and reshingle his roof. In fact, they were even a little late getting to school. When they finally showed up, Mr. Krupp was standing at the front door waiting for them. And boy, was he mad. Mr. Krupp ordered the boys into his office and slammed the door. All right, where were you two this morning? He growled. We wanted to come over to your house, said George, but we were busy trying to figure out the secret of this ring. What ring? George held up his hand and showed the ring to Principal Krupp. It's got one of those weird patterns on it. If you stare at it long enough, a picture appears. We'll hold it still. I can't see the darn thing. I have to move it back and forth, or else it won't work. Mr. Krupp's eyes followed the ring back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, and back and forth. You have to stare deeper into the ring, said Harold. Deeper, 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 deeper. You are getting sleepy, said George. Very sleepy. Mr. Krupp's eyelids began to drop. I'm so sleepy, he mumbled. After a few minutes, Mr. Krupp's eyes were closed tight and he began to snore. You are under our spell, said George. When I snap my fingers, you will obey our every command. Snap. I will obey, mumbled Mr. Krupp. All right, have you still got that videotape of me and Harold? Yes, mumbled Mr. Krupp. Well, hand it over, bub, George instructed. Mr. Krupp unlocked a large file cabinet and opened the bottom drawer. He reached in and handed George the videotape. George stuffed it in his backpack. Harold took a different video out of his backpack and put it in the file cabinet. What's that video? It's one of my sister's old Boomer the Purple Dragon sing-along videos. Nice touch, said George. Fun with hypnosis. When Harold bent down to close the cabinet, he got a quick look inside. Whoa, he cried. Look at all the stuff in here. The file cabinet was filled with everything Mr. Krupp had taken away from the boys over the years. There were slingshots, whoopee cushions, skateboards, fake doggy-doo, you name it, it was in there. Look at this, a big stack of Captain Underpants comics. He's got every issue, said Harold. For hours, the two boys sat on the floor reading, laughing and reading their comics. Finally, George looked at the clock. Yikes, it's almost lunchtime. We better clean up this mess and get to class. The boys looked at their principal, who had been standing behind them in a trance all morning. Gee, I almost forgot about Mr. Krupp, said Harold. What should we do with him? You want to have some fun? Asked George. Why not? I haven't had any fun in the last 4 to 6 weeks. Cool, said George. He walked up to Mr. Krupp and snapped his fingers. Snap! You are a chicken, he said. Suddenly Mr. Krupp leaped onto his desk and flapped his arms. Clap, 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 he cried, kicking his papers off the desk behind him and pecking at his pen and pencil set. George and Harold howled with laughter. Let me try, said Harold. You are a monkey. You gotta snap your fingers, said George. Oh yeah, snap, you are a monkey. Suddenly Mr. Krupp sprang off from the desk and began swinging from the fluorescent light fixtures. Ooh, 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 he shrieked, leaping from one side of the room to the other. George and Harold laughed so hard they almost cried. My turn. Let's see, what should we turn him into next? I know, Harold said, holding up his Captain Underpants comic. Let's turn him into Captain Underpants. Good idea, said George. Snap! You're now the greatest superhero of all time, the amazing Captain Underpants. Mr. Krupp tore down the red curtain from his office window and tied it around his neck. Then he took off his shoes, socks, shirts, pants, and his awful toupee. That was Captain Underpants, and I'm Max Runner Bland.
So I'm just going to check the stream really quick because it is showing that it's having difficulty.
So it's Runner, not Runner?
Yeah, that's right. Or no, it's Runner, sorry. Can I have a cookie?
Yes, you may have a
You've worked
good.
hard. You have 2. Oh,
Go for it.
well done. You did a great job. Do we just start now?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. You gotta snap your fingers, said George. Oh, yes, said Harold. You are a monkey! And suddenly Mr. Krupp sprang off his desk and began swinging from the fluorescent light fixtures. Ooh, he shrieked, leaping from one side of the room to the other. George and Harold laughed so hard they almost cried. My turn, said George. Let's see, what should we turn him into next? I know, Harold said, holding up a Captain Underpants comic. Let's turn him into Captain Underpants. Good idea, said George. You are now the greatest superhero of all time, the amazing Captain Underpants. And Mr. Krupp tore down the red curtain from his office window and tied it around his neck. Then he took off his shoes, socks, shirt, pants, and his awful toupee. Tra-la-la, he sang. Mr. Krupp stood before them, looking quite triumphant, with his cape blowing in the breeze of the open window. George and Harold were dumbfounded. You know, said George, he kind of looks like Captain Underpants. Yeah, Harold replied. And after a short silence, the two boys looked at each other and then burst into laughter. George and Harold had never laughed so hard in all their lives. Tears ran down their faces as they rolled about the floor, shrieking in hysterics. But after a while, George pulled himself up from the floor for another look. Hey, George cried. Where'd he go? Chapter 12, Out the Window. George and Harold dashed to the window and looked out. There, running across the parking lot, was a pudgy old guy in his underwear with a red cape billowing from behind, throwing tra-la-la. Mr. Krupp, come back, shouted Harold. Oh, he won't answer to that, said George. He thinks he's Captain Underpants now. Oh, no, said Harold. He's probably running off to fight crime, said George. Oh, no, said Harold. And we gotta stop him, said George. Oh, no, cried Harold. No way. Look, said George, he could get killed out there. Harold was unmoved. Or worse, said George, we could get into big trouble. Oh, you're right, said Harold. We gotta go after him. And the two boys opened the bottom file cabinet drawer and took out their slingshots and skateboards. Do you think we should bring anything else? Asked Harold. Yes, said George. Let's bring the fake doggy doo-doo. Good thinking, said Harold. You just never know when fake doggy doo-doo is gonna come in handy. Harold stuffed Mr. Crupp's clothes, shoes, and toupee into his backpack. Then together the two boys leaped out the window, slid down the flagpole, and took off on their skateboards after the amazing Captain Underpants. Chapter 13. Bank Robbers. George and Harold rode their skateboards all over town looking for Captain Underpants. "I can't find him anywhere," said Harold. "You'd think a guy like him would be easy to spot," said George. Then the boys turned a corner, and there he was. Captain Underpants was standing in front of a bank looking quite heroic. "Mr. Krupp!" cried Harold. "Shh!" said George. "Don't call him that. Call him Captain Underpants." "Oh, yeah," said Harold. "And don't forget to snap your fingers," said George. "Right," said Harold. But before he got a chance, the bank doors flew wide open and out stepped two robbers. The robbers took one look at Captain Underpants and stopped dead in their tracks. "Surrender," said Captain Underpants, "or I will have to resort to wedgie power." "Oh, no," whispered Harold and George. Nobody moved for about 10 seconds. Finally, the robbers looked at each other and burst out laughing. They dropped their loot and fell to the sidewalk, screaming in hysterics. Almost immediately, the cops showed up and arrested the crooks. "Let that be a lesson to you," cried Captain Underpants. "Never underestimate the power of underwear." And the police chief, looking quite angry, marched over to Captain Underpants. "And just who the heck are you supposed to be?" the police chief demanded. "Why, I'm Captain Underpants, the world's greatest superhero," said Captain Underpants. "I fight for truth, justice, and all that is pre-shunk and cottony." "Oh, yeah?" shouted the police chief. "Cuff 'em, boys." And one of the cops took out his handcuffs and grabbed Captain Underpants by the arm. "Uh-oh," cried George. "We gotta roll." And together the two boys zoomed into the crowd, weaving in and out of cops and bystanders. Harold skated up to Captain Underpants and knocked the superhero off his feet. George caught him, and the boys skated away with Captain Underpants on their shoulders. "Stop!" cried the cops, but it was too late. George, Harold, and Captain Underpants were gone. Chapter 14. The Big Bang. After their quick escape, George, Harold, and Captain Underpants stopped on a deserted street corner to catch their breath. "Okay," said George, "let's dehypnotize him quickly before anything else kaboom happens." Uh-oh. A huge explosion came from the rare crystal shop across the street. Heavy smoke poured out of the building. Suddenly, two robots with one stolen crystal emerged from the smoke and jumped into an old van. "Did I just see two robots get into a van?" asked Harold. "You know," said George, "up until now the story was almost believable." "Well, believable or not," said Harold, "we're not getting involved. I repeat, we are not getting involved." And just then Captain Underpants leaped from the street corner and dashed in front of the van. "Stop! In the name of underwear!" he cried. "Uh-oh," said George, "I think we're involved." And the two robots started up the van and swerved around Captain Underpants. Unfortunately, the van brushed up against his red cape, and it got caught. With a mighty jerk, Captain Underpants flipped backward, and the van pulled him along as it drove away in the bad guy's van. "Grab him!" cried George. The two boys skateboarded with all their might toward the speeding van and grabbed Captain Underpants by the ankles. "Help!" they cried as the van pulled them through the city streets. "Mommy," said a little boy sitting on a bench, "I just saw two robots driving a van with a guy in his underwear hanging off the back by a red cape, pulling two boys on skateboards behind him with his feet." "How did you expect me to believe such a ridiculous story?" asked his mother, who was reading about Bigfoot giving birth to a 200-pound baby. And finally, the van came to a screeching halt in front of an old abandoned warehouse. The sudden stop made Captain Underpants flip over the roof of the van and crash through the front door of the building. "Well, well, well," said a strange voice from inside the warehouse. "It looks as though we have a visitor." Chapter 15. Dr. Diaper. George and Harold hid behind the van until the coast was clear. Then they sneaked up to the hole in the door and peeked inside. Captain Underpants was all tied up. The two robots were standing guard, and a strange little man wearing a diaper was laughing maniacally. Ha 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 ha! I am the evil Dr. Diaper, the strange little man told Captain Underpants, and you will be the first to witness my takeover of the world! And Dr. Diaper placed the stolen crystal into a large machine called the Lasermatic 2000. The machine started to light up and make loud noises. Heavy gears began shifting and spinning, and a laser beam from the crystal shot straight up through a hole in the roof. In exactly 20 minutes, this laser beam will blow up the moon and send huge chunks of it crashing down upon every major city in the world, laughed Dr. Diaper. Ha ha ha, then I will rise from the rubble and take over the planet. Only one thing can help us now, said George. What? Asked Harold. Rubber doggy doo-doo, said George. Harold took the fake doggy doo-doo and a slingshot from George's backpack and handed them to him. Be careful, said Harold. The fate of the entire planet is in your hands. With careful and precise aim, George shot the rubber doo-doo through the air and across the room. It landed with a plop right at the feet of Dr. Diaper. Yes, whispered George and Harold. Dr. Diaper looked down at the doo-doo between his feet and turned bright red. Oh, dear me, he cried. I'm dreadfully embarrassed. Please excuse me. He began to waddle toward the restroom. This has never happened to me before, I assure you, he said. I guess with all the excitement, I just, oh dear, oh dear. While Dr. Diaper was off changing himself, George and Harold sneaked into the old warehouse. Immediately, the robots detected the boys and began marching toward them. Destroy the intruders, said the robots. Destroy the intruders. George and Harold screamed and ran to the back of the warehouse. Luckily, George found 2 old boards and gave one of them to Harold. We're not going to have to resort to extremely graphic violence, are we? Asked Harold. I sure hope not, said George. Chapter 16, the extremely graphic violence chapter. Warning. The following chapter contains graphic scenes showing 2 boys beating the tar out of a couple of robots. If you have high blood pressure or if you faint at the sight of motor oil, we strongly urge you to take better care of yourself and stop being such a baby. And we're now coming to the Flipperama portion. Introducing Flipperama! As everybody knows, nothing enhances silly action sequences more than really cheesy animation. And so, for the first time in the history of great literature, we proudly giving you the latest in cheesy animation technology, the art of Flipperama! So, step 1, here's how it works. We're going to place our left hand inside the dotted lines marked left hand here. We're going to hold the book open flat. We are going to grasp the right hand page with our right thumb and index finger. Inside the dotted lines, right thumb here. Step 3, now quickly flip the right hand page back and forth until the picture appears to be animated. And we can also do our own sound effects. Oh my goodness. Okay. I don't know if we can capture this, so we'll go slow. Flipperama 1. Remember, flip only page 83. When you are flipping, be sure you can see the picture on page 83, and the one on 85. If you flip quickly, the 2 pictures will start to look like one animated picture. Don't forget to add your own sound effects. So this is Robot Rampage. So right thumb here, left hand here. We'll do it over here. And am I doing this right? So there we go, guys. And remember, flip only page 87, and while you are flipping, be sure you can see the picture on page 87 and the one on 89. Oops, we have a lovely assistant, Stacy, here. And don't forget to add your own sound effects. Whop, whoosh, schwa. George saves Harold. Harold returns the favor. Harold returns the favor again. Mixed nuts and bolts. Mixed nuts and bolts. Chapter 17. The Escape. After defeating the robots, George and Harold untied Captain Underpants. "Come on," cried Harold. "Let's get out of here." "Wait," said Captain Underpants. "We have to save the world first." So George, Harold, and Captain Underpants frantically looked all around for the Lasermatic 2000, searching for a way to shut it down and stop the inevitable disaster. Said Harold, "I think this might be the lever we want." He pulled the self-destruct lever with all his might, and suddenly the Lasermatic 2000 began to sputter and shake. The huge laser beam turned off, and pieces of the machine began flying all over in all directions. "It's gonna blow!" cried Harold. "Run for your lives!" "Not so fast!" cried Dr. Diaper, who had appeared out of nowhere. "You demolished my robots, you destroyed my Lasermatic 2000, and you ruined my one chance to take over the world. But you won't live to tell the tale." And Dr. Diaper pulled out his Diapermatic 2000 ray gun and pointed it at George, Harold, and Captain Underpants. Captain Underpants quickly stretched a pair of underwear and shot it at Dr. Diaper. The underwear landed right on the evil doctor's head. "Help!" cried Dr. Diaper. "I can't see! I can't see!" And George and Harold ran out of the warehouse as fast as they could. "Great shot, Captain Underpants!" cried Harold. "There's just one thing I don't understand," said George. "Where did you get the extra pair of underwear?" "What extra pair?" said Captain Underpants. Uh-oh. "Never mind that," cried George. "Let's just get out of here before that Lasermatic 2000 thing X." Kaboom! Explodes! The Lasermatic 2000 blew up, tearing apart the old warehouse. It sent flaming shards of red-hot metal in every direction. Fire fell from the skies around our heroes, and the earth began to crumble beneath their feet. "Oh no!" cried Harold. "We're doomed!" Chapter 18. To make a long story short, they got away. Chapter 19. Back to school. George, Harold, and Captain Underpants made a quick stop outside the police station. They tied Dr. Diaper to a lamppost and attached a note to him that says, "Arrest me." "There," said Captain Underpants, "that ought to explain everything." And the police have left a sign saying, "Back in 15 minutes, please don't commit any crimes till we return." And then George and Harold led Captain Underpants back to Jerome Horowitz Elementary School. "Why are we going here?" asked Captain Underpants. "Well," said George, "you have to do some undercover work here." "Yeah," said Harold, reaching into his backpack. Put those clothes on and make it snappy. And don't forget your hair," said George. So Captain Underpants quickly got dressed behind some bushes. "Well, how do I look?" he asked. "Pretty good," said George. "Now try to look really mad." Captain Underpants made the nastiest face he could. "You know," said Harold, "he kind of looks like Mr. Krupp." "Harold," whispered George, "he is Mr. Krupp." "Oh, yeah," said Harold, "I almost forgot." Before long, they were all back inside Mr. Krupp's office. "Okay, Captain Underpants," said George, "you are now Mr. Krupp." "Snap your fingers," whispered Harold. "Oh, yeah," said George, "you are now Mr. Krupp." "Who's Mr. Krupp?" asked Captain Underpants. "Oh, no!" cried Harold. "It's not working." And the boys tried again and again to dehypnotize Captain Underpants, but nothing seemed to work. Said Harold. "Let me see the instruction manual for that ring." George checked his pants pockets. Said George, "I think I lost it." "You what?" cried Harold. The two boys reached frantically and searched frantically through the office, but the 3D Hypno Ring instruction manual was nowhere to be found. "Never mind," said George. "I have an idea." He removed the flowers from a large vase in the corner. Then he poured out all the water over Captain Underpants' head. "What did you do that for?" cried Harold. "I saw them doing a cartoon once," said George, "so it's gotta work." After a few minutes, Captain Krupp slowly came to. "What's going on here?" he demanded, "and why am I all wet?" George and Harold had never been so glad. "No ring instruction manual. It was in my shirt pocket, not my pants pocket." "Well, throw that thing away," said Harold. "We'll never need it again."
Just 1 sec. Alright, assume it's going and then I'll check again.
Hey, look, said George. I found the 3D Hypno Ring instruction manual. It was in my shirt pocket, not my pants pocket. Well, throw that thing away, said Harold. We'll never need it again. I sure hope not, said George. And it says, warning, whatever you do, don't pour water on anyone's head when they are in a trance. This will cause the hypnotized person to slip back and forth from trance to reality whenever they hear the sound of fingers snapping. Uh-oh. So, here we've got the football players going Purple Dragon sing along. Friends, la la la, we love Boomer, la la la. Things at Jerome Horowitz Elementary School were never quite the same after that fatal day. The football team enjoyed Mr. Krupp's video so much they changed the name from the Knuckleheads to the Purple Dragon Sing Along Friends. The name change didn't go over too well with the fans, but hey, who's going to argue with a bunch of linebackers? George and Harold went back to their old ways, pulling pranks, cracking jokes, and making new comic books. They had to keep an eye on Mr. Krupp, though, because for some strange reason, every time he heard the sound of fingers snapping, Principal Krupp turned back into... you know who. Oh no, cried Harold. Here we go again, cried George. Tra-la-la! The end. And now we have Captain Underpants and the Attack of the Talking Trolls. The second epic novel by Dav Pilkey. For Alan Boyko. Hello. Before you read this book, there's some things you should know. So Harold and I have created this informative pamphlet to fill you in on all the details. Please don't let this comic fall into the wrong hands. The top secret truth about Captain Underpants. I started this one.
Okay.
By George Beard and Harold Hutchins, who deny everything. Once upon a time, there were two cool kids named George and Harold. We are cool. Me too. They made their own comics about a superhero named Captain Underpants. And everybody thought their comics were funny. Ha 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 ha. Except for their mean old principal, Mr. Krupp. Blah, blah, blah. One time, Mr. Krupp was being mean to George and Harold. Blah, blah, blah. So they bought the 3D Hypno Ring. And they hypnotized Mr. Krupp, who says, I will obey. Then they turned him into Captain Underpants. But Mr. Krupp thought he really was Captain Underpants. And he jumped out of the window to fight crime. Uh-oh. And he's going, tra-la-la. And George and Harold tried to stop him, but they had to save the world first. Kaboom. And when they got back to school, George poured water on Captain Underpants' head. He turned back into Mr. Krupp, but something was wrong. Because now, for some strange reason, every time Mr. Krupp hears somebody snap their fingers, he turns back into Captain Underpants. Tra-la-la! So whatever you do, please don't snap your fingers around Mr. Krupp. Please, 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 don't snap those fingers. This has been a public service announcement from George and Harold, who still deny everything. The end. Chapter 1. George and Harold. This is George Beard and Harold Hutchins. George is the kid on the left with the tie and the flap top. Harold is the one on the right with the t-shirt and the bad haircut. Remember that now. And they're going to Joe's Furniture. Come in and see our pretty armchairs. Depending on who you asked, you'd probably hear a lot of different things about George and Harold. Their teacher, Ms. Ribble, might say that George and Harold were disruptive and behaviorally challenged. Their gym teacher, Mr. Meaner, might have added that they were in serious need of a major attitude adjustment. Their principal, Mr. Krupp, would probably have a few more choice words to include, like sneaky, criminally mischievous, and I'll get those boys if it's the last thing I do. Well, you get the idea. But if you asked their parents, they'd probably tell you that George and Harold were smart and sweet and very good-hearted, even if they were a little silly sometimes. And I'd have to agree with their parents. Uh-oh, and these guys are rearranging Joe's Furniture sign, and it now says, come and see our hairy armpits. But even so, their silliness did get them into a lot of trouble sometimes. In fact, it once got them into so much trouble, they accidentally almost destroyed the whole planet with an army of evil, vicious, talking toilets. Oops. But before I can tell you that story, I have to tell you this story. Chapter 2. This story. One fine morning at Jerome Horowitz Elementary School, George and Harold had just gotten out of their 4th grade remedial gym class when they saw a big sign in the hallway. It was an announcement for the 2nd annual Invention Convention. 2nd annual Invention Convention, grand prize. George and Harold had fond memories of last year's Invention Convention, but this year's convention was a bit different. The first prize winner got to be principal for the day. Wow, said George. Whoever gets to be principal gets to make up all the rules for the whole day. And everybody in school has to follow those rules. We have got to win the first prize this year, exclaimed Harold. Just then, George and Harold's principal, Mr. Krupp, showed up. Aha, he shouted. I'll bet you two are up to no good. Not really, said George. We were just reading about this year's contest. Yeah, said Harold. We're going to be in first prize in the contest and be principals for the day. Ha 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 ha, laughed Mr. Krupp. Do you honestly think I'd let you two enter this year's contest after the stunt you pulled at last year's Invention Convention? George and Harold smiled and thought back to the first annual Invention Convention. Chapter 3, The Flashback. It was about 1 year earlier, and all of the faculty and students of Jerome Horwitz Elementary School had gathered in the gymnasium for what would later be known as the sticky chair incident. George and Harold stepped up to the microphone. Ladies and gentlemen, said George, Harold and I have invented something that is guaranteed to keep you all glued to your seats. Yes, said Harold. We call it glue. Mr. Krupp became very angry. You two did not invent glue, he shouted. He stood up to take the microphone away from Harold, and his chair stood up with him. Everybody in the gymnasium laughed. The school secretary, Miss Anthrope, stood up to help Mr. Krupp's chair from his pants, but her chair stood up with her too, and everyone in the gymnasium laughed even harder. The other teachers stood up, and, you guessed it, they were stuck to their chairs as well. Everyone in the audience howled with laughter. One kid stood up to go to the bathroom, and his chair came up with him also. The audience stopped laughing so hard. They all quickly checked their chairs, and suddenly the laughter stopped completely. Everyone in the whole school was glued to their seats. You see, while it was true that George and Harold had not invented glue, they had invented a new kind of glue. By simply mixing rubber cement with concentrated orange juice mix, they had created a quick-drying, body heat-activated glue. Then they applied this special glue to every seat in the gymnasium, except theirs, early that morning. Everybody in the gymnasium was glaring at George and Harold and seething with anger. I've got a good idea, said George. What? Asked Harold. Run! Cried George. George and Harold were grinning from ear to ear, remembering that silly invention and the chaos that followed. Oh, that was hilarious, laughed Harold. Yeah, chuckled George. It'll be hard to top that this year. Well, you won't get a chance this year, said Mr. Krupp. He took out a magnifying glass and held it up to the fine print on the sign. This contest is open to all students in the 3rd and 4th grade except George Beard and Harold Hutchins. You mean we can't enter the contest? Asked Harold. It's worse than that, laughed Mr. Krupp. Ha ha ha. You boys can't even attend this year's convention. I'm putting you two in study hall that whole day. And Mr. Krupp turned and walked away, laughing victoriously. Ah ha ha ha. Rats, said Harold. What are we going to do now? Well, said George, you know the old saying, if you can't join 'em, beat 'em. Chapter 4, The Invention.
Thank you, Miss Paulina.
You're very welcome. My pleasure.
Chapter 4, The Invention. Early that evening, George and Harold sneaked back to school with their supplies. They crept into the gymnasium and peeked around. I think somebody's still in here, whispered Harold. Oh, it's just Melvin Sneedley, said George. Melvin was a school brainiac. He was busy putting some last-minute touches on his new invention for the contest. We should wait here until he leaves, whispered Harold. No way, said George. He could be here all night. Let's just go over and talk to him. When Melvin saw George and Harold approaching, he was not happy. Oh, no, he said. I'll bet you guys are here to mess with everybody's inventions. Nice guess, said George. Listen, we promise not to mess with your invention if you promise not to tell anybody that you saw us here tonight. Melvin looked lovingly at his invention and reluctantly agreed. I promise, he said. Great, said George. Say, What is an invention of yours anyway? It just looks like a photocopy machine. Well, it used to be a photocopy machine, said Melvin, but I've made some major adjustments to it. Now it is an invention that will revolutionize the world. I call it the Patsy 2000. It'll revolutionize the world, and you named it Patsy? Asked Harold. Yes, said Melvin. Patsy is an acronym for Photo Atomic Transmogloving. I'm sorry, I asked, said Harold. Allow me to demonstrate, said Melvin. The Patsy 2000 can take any one-dimensional image and create a living, breathing, three-dimensional copy of that image. For example, take this ordinary photograph of a mouse. Melvin placed a photo of the mouse onto the glass screen of the Patsy 2000 and pressed start. The lights in the gymnasium dimmed as all the power in the entire school seemed to get sucked into the Patsy 2000. Soon the machine began to vibrate and hum loudly, and tiny bolts of static electricity snapped out from underneath. I hope that thing doesn't explode, said Harold. Oh, this is nothing, said Melvin. You should have seen how the Patsy 2000 reacted when I copied a poodle. Finally, after a series of flashes and loud zaps, everything stopped. A small ding was heard. Then a tiny mouse crawled out the side door of the Patsy 2000 and onto the floor. Isn't it wonderful? Exclaimed Melvin. George inspected the mouse closely. That's a great trick, George laughed. You really had me going for a while. It's not a trick, cried Melvin. The Patsy 2000 really does bring photos to life. I even created living creatures from paintings and drawings. Yeah, right, laughed Harold. And I thought we were con artists. George and Harold walked away chuckling. It was time to move on to bigger and better things. Chapter 5, Bigger and Better Things. George and Harold went to the other end of the gymnasium, opened their backpacks, and began to work. George busied himself by turning all the spray nozzles on the automatic dog washer around, while Harold filled up the soap tank with India ink. Then they moved to the volcano detector. Will you please pass me the big bag of butterscotch pudding and a Phillips head screwdriver? Asked Harold. Sure, said George, as he carefully inserted eggs into the electric ping-pong ball server. Chapter 6, The Invention Convention. The following day started out sunny and cheerful. The students and faculty filed into the gymnasium and checked the seats very carefully before sitting down. Greetings, said Mr. Krupp, who was standing up at the microphone. You don't need to worry about sticky seats today, he said. I've taken measures to ensure that this invention convention won't be a disaster like last year's. Everyone settled in as Madison Mancini, a third grader, stepped on stage to demonstrate her automatic dog washer. First, said Madison, you put your dog in the tub. Then you press this button. Madison pressed the start button. At first, nothing happened. And then suddenly, a spurt of inky black water sprayed up and out over the crowd. Everyone, except the dog, got soaked, as Madison tried desperately to turn off the sprayers. I can't stop it, she cried. Someone turned all the nozzles around. Now who could have done that? Asked Mr. Krupp. Next up was Donnie Schumeyer with his electric ping-pong ball server. He turned the machine on, and immediately it began hurling extra-large, grade-A eggs into the crowd. Boop, 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 boop went the machine. Splat, 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 splat went the eggs. I can't turn the machine off, cried Donnie. Somebody jammed a paper clip into the controller. Now who could have done that? Asked Miss Ripple. Freddie Moore's volcano detector was also a big flop. When Freddie connected the circuits to the 9-volt battery, a large spring, which had been crammed into the center of his miniature volcano, launched a giant plastic bag of butterscotch pudding high into the crowd. It landed somewhere between the third and fourth rows. Splat! Hey, whined Freddie, somebody put pudding in my volcano. Now who could have done that? Asked Mr. Meaner. The rest of the day went on much the same way, with people shouting everything from, "Hey, who put oatmeal in my solar-powered leaf blower?" to, "Hey, who let all the mice out of my treadmill dune buggy?" It wasn't long before everyone fled the gymnasium, and the second annual invention convention had to be called off. "How could this have happened?" cried Mr. Krupp, as he wiped chocolate syrup, pencil shavings, and cream of mushroom soup off his face and shirt. "George and Harold have been in study hall all day long. I put them there myself." Excuse me, Mr. Krupp," said Melvin Sneely. "I think I have an answer to your question." Chapter 7. Busted. Crash went the door to the study hall room. Mr. Krupp stomped in like a crazy person. George and Harold had never seen him this upset before. "You boys are in so much trouble," Mr. Krupp shouted. "I'm putting you two on permanent detention for the rest of the school year." "Wait a second," cried George. "You can't prove anything." "Yeah," said Harold. "We've been here all day." Mr. Krupp smiled devilishly and looked toward the door. "Oh, Melvin," he called. Melvin Sneely stepped into the room, covered in mustard, eggshells, and shredded coconut. "They did it," Melvin said, pointing at George and Harold. "I saw them last night in the gym." "Melvin!" cried George, horrified. "You promised." "I changed my mind," Melvin said, grinning smugly. "Have fun in detention." Chapter 8. The Invention Convention Detention. After school, Mr. Krupp ushered George and Harold into the detention room and wrote a long sentence on the chalkboard. "From now on," growled Mr. Krupp, "you boys will spend 2 hours a day after school copying this sentence over and over. I want every chalkboard in this room filled completely." On his way out the door, Mr. Krupp turned and said with an evil grin, "And if either of you leave this room for any reason, I'm going to suspend you both." The blackboard the boys wrote, "I'll never do anything which angers my handsome and charming principal, Mr. Krupp, ever, ever, ever again." Now, as you might have guessed, writing sentences was nothing new to George and Harold. The two boys waited until Mr. Krupp left the room, and then they took 4 homemade wooden rods out of their backpacks. The rods had holes in them that George and Harold had drilled in George's dad's workshop. George screwed the rods together, while Harold inserted a piece of chalk into each hole. And then they each took a pole and began copying Mr. Krupp's sentence. And every time they wrote one sentence, the wooden poles made 12. After about 3.5 minutes, every chalkboard in the room was completely filled. George and Harold sat down and admired their work. "We've got a lot of time on our hands now," said George. "Got any ideas?" "Let's make a new comic book," said Harold. So the two boys took out some paper and pens and created an all-new adventure about their favorite superhero. It was called Captain Underpants and the Attack of the Talking Toilets. Chapter 9. Captain Underpants and the Attack of the Talking Toilets by George Beard and Harold Hutchins. One day at school, everything was pretty normal. The lunch ladies were serving toasted rat sandwiches. The principal was yelling, blah, blah, blah. And the gym teacher was being mean to everybody. "My grandma can run faster than you guys." And then a UFO appeared. It zapped the school with an evil ray. The ray made all the toilets come to life, and it made them evil too. The toilets were hungry. Yum, 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 eat 'em up. So they ate the gym teacher. Help! The toilets just scratched somebody's car and ate up the gym teacher. Lord have mercy, was it my car? This looks like a job for Captain Underpants. Captain Underpants ran to the storage room. Yum, 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 eat 'em up. And he found a bunch of plungers. He put them in the toilets. Their mouths got stuck. Hooray for Captain Underpants! And now to stop that evil UFO. Captain Underpants went outside and saw the UFO. It opened up, and out jumped the terrible Turbo Toilet 2000. I'll flush you. They had a big fight. Captain Underpants was faster than a speeding waistband, more powerful than boxer shorts, and able to leap tall buildings without getting a wedgie. Captain Underpants snuck up behind the Turbo Toilet 2000 and gave him a wedgie. Wedgie power! He goes, ouchie! And then he hung the Turbo 2000 on a stop sign and pulled back hard. And then he let go. Twang! Kaboom! The spaceship blew up, and all the toilets returned to normal. Hooray! And even the gym teacher escaped. Aw, man. The end. Chapter 10. A Big Mistake. George and Harold sat together in the detention room, reading through their newest comic book and beaming proudly. We've got to go to the office and make copies of this, said George, so we can sell them on the playground tomorrow. We can't, said Harold. Don't you remember? Mr. Krupp said he'd suspend us if we caught us leaving this room. Then we won't let him catch us, said George. George and Harold sneaked out of the room quietly and crawled down the hall to the office. Uh-oh, said Harold. There's a bunch of teachers in there. We'll never get to use a copy machine. Said George. Are there any other copy machines in this school? How about the one that Melvin had in the gym? Asked Harold. Oh, yeah, said George. George and Harold crept over to the gym and found the Patsy 2000. I wonder if this machine still makes copies, said Harold. Melvin did say that he had made some adjustments to it. Oh, he probably just crammed a mouse in there to fool us, said George. It's the oldest trick in the book. I'm sure the machine still makes regular copies. George placed the cover of their new comic book face down on the glass screen and pressed start. All at once, the lights in the whole school dimmed, and the Patsy 2000 began to shake and clunk around wildly. Giant volts of static electricity zapped out the bottom of the machine as a great whirlwind rose from the top. Loose papers and other small objects in the room were sucked into the wind, and they spun above the machine like a raging cyclone. I don't think it's supposed to do this, shouted George over the horrible noise. Finally, after a series of flashes and loud zaps, the noise, wind, and sparks stopped altogether. The only sound that could be heard was of something groaning and clawing about inside the bloated, battered frame of the Patsy 2000. It sounds like something's alive inside there, said Harold. George snatched the comic book from the top of the machine. Let's get out of here, he cried. Just then a small ding was heard, and a full-size, shining white toilet emerged from the side of the Patsy 2000. Its teeth were sharp and jagged, and its angry eyeballs glowed with red, swelling veins. Yum, yum, eat 'em up, cried the evil toilet. Almost immediately, another talking toilet emerged, followed by another and another and another. Yum, 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 eat 'em up, they cried. Oh, no! Melvin was right! The photoatomic trans-summaglobin yummer really does create living, breathing, three-dimensional copies of one-dimensional images. Harold cried. I've got an idea, said George. What? Asked Harold. Run! Cried George. Chapter 11. The Invention, Convention, Detention, Suspension. George and Harold screamed and ran out the gym door, closing it tightly behind them. Aha! Yelled Mr. Krupp, who was just coming down the hall. You boys left the detention room. You know what that means, don't you? It wasn't our fault, cried Harold. Too bad, Mr. Krupp shouted with delight. You boys are officially suspended. Wait, cried George. You've got to listen. Behind this door is an army of evil, vicious talk. I don't have to listen to you boys ever again, laughed Mr. Krupp. Now get your stuff and get out of this school. But, Harold stammered. You don't understand. Get out, Mr. Krupp screamed. George and Harold groaned and walked to their lockers to collect their stuff. Gosh, said Harold. In one day we've gotten a detention, a suspension, and we've created an army of evil talking toilets who want to take over the world. That's a pretty bad day even by our standards, said George. Oh well, said Harold. I just hope things don't get any worse. Chapter 12. Things get worse. Word spread quickly throughout the office that George and Harold had been suspended. The teachers rushed out to cheer and laugh at the two boys. You're in big trouble now, chuckled Miss Anthrop. I can't wait to call your parents and tell them the news. Let's take their desks outside and chop them up, cried Miss Ripple. Let's throw a party in the gym, shouted Mr. Meaner. No, cried George. Whatever you do, don't open the door to the gym. We can do whatever we like, snarled Mr. Meaner as he dashed over to the gymnasium door. Look, I'm opening the door. He quickly opened the gym door. Now I'm closing the door, he said. And now I'm opening the door again. And now I'm... Ah! An evil toilet had stuck its mouth through the door, snapped Mr. Meaner up, and swallowed him whole. Flush! The talking toilets then pushed their way through the open gymnasium doors and spilled out into the hallway. Yum, 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 eat 'em up, the toilets bellowed. Yum, 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 eat 'em up. The teachers couldn't believe their eyes. They screamed and ran for their lives. Only Mr. Krupp, Miss Ripple, and George and Harold remained frozen in fear. They watched paralyzed as the talking toilets came nearer and nearer. Finally, Miss Ripple pointed at the toilets and snapped her fingers. Snap! Go away, she cried. Go away this minute. But the toilets didn't listen. They moved closer and closer. Finally, Miss Ripple turned and ran. Mr. Krupp, however, just stood there in a daze. George and Harold looked up at him. Uh-oh, said Harold. Did she just snap her fingers? Yep, said George. Now we're really in trouble. And George was right, for at that moment Mr. Krupp had begun to change. A silly, heroic smile came over his face as he stood defiantly before his foes. I'll put a stop to you vile villains, he said fearlessly. But first, I need some supplies. Mr. Krupp turned and dashed to his office. George and Harold ran after him. Why did Miss Ripple have to snap her fingers? Cried Harold. Why? Never mind that, cried George. Mr. Krupp has turned into Captain Underpants. We've got to pour water over his head before it's too late. Chapter 13. It's too late. When George and Harold reached Mr. Krupp's office, they found only his clothes, shoes, and toupee on the floor. Look, said Harold. The window is open, and one of the red curtains is missing. What do we do now? Asked George. Do we save Captain Underpants, or do we stay here and get eaten by a bunch of toilets? Let me think about that one, said Harold as he climbed out the window. George had actually collected Mr. Krupp's things and shoved them into his backpack. Then he jumped out the window after Harold. The two boys slid down the flagpole and ran off after Captain Underpants. Where does he think he's going? Asked George. I have no idea, said Harold. But we'd better run fast because I think we're being followed. Captain Underpants dashed through the backyards of some nearby houses and collected pairs of underwear from the clothesline. Mommy, said a little boy looking out his window, a man in a red cape just stole our underwear. And now two boys are being chased by a ferocious-looking toilet with sharp, pointed teeth screaming, yum, 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 eat 'em up. Yeah, right, laughed his mother. Just how gullible do you think I am? Chapter 14, The Talking Toilet Takeover. When Captain Underpants was finished commandeering the underwear of local civilians, he dashed back to Jerome Horowitz Elementary to save the day. The school was now overrun with chaos. Miss Ripple came tearing out the door, followed by several evil toilets. "Help me!" she cried. "They've swallowed every teacher in the whole building except me." "Don't worry, ma'am. I won't let them eat you up," Captain Underpants said. "As I toilet ate her up." "Oops," said Captain Underpants. Now only George, Harold, and Captain Underpants were left. They stood on the front lawn of the school, completely surrounded by hungry, drooling toilets. "Yum, yum, yum, eat 'em up," the talking toilets chanted. "Yum, yum, yum, eat 'em up. Yum, 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 eat 'em up. Yum, 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 eat 'em up." "We're doomed," cried Harold. "Never underestimate the power of underwear," cried Captain Underpants as he stretched and shot underwear into the waiting mouths of the talking toilets. Unfortunately, the toilets just swallowed the underwear whole. It only seemed to make them hungrier and hungrier. "If only we could think of something that could make them really sick," said George. "Yeah," Harold continued. "Something so vile and disgusting it would make them all blow their cookies and wreath in agony." Suddenly, George and Harold's faces lit up. "Cafeteria food!" they shouted. And faster than a speeding waistband, our three heroes dashed into the school. Chapter 15, Creamed Chipped Beef to the Rescue. George, Harold, and Captain Underpants got inside the school safely and closed the front door behind them. "I think the toilets are all outside," said George. "But not for long," said Harold. Quickly they ran to the school's kitchen and discovered a cart holding a large vat of something green and sludgy. "Yuck," said George, holding his nose. "What is that stuff?" "I think it's tomorrow's lunch," said Harold. "Perfect," said George. "I never thought I'd be glad to see creamed chipped beef." Together they wheeled a tub of sticky green glob down the hallway and out the side door of the school. Captain Underpants sat on the cart and stretched a pair of underwear over his head like a slingshot. George stood over him, scooped some cafeteria food into the underwear, and stretched it back. Harold wheeled the cart toward the talking toilets. "Tra-la-la!" shouted Captain Underpants loudly. The talking toilets turned and saw our three heroes. All at once they shouted, "Yum, yum, yum, eat 'em up!" and the chase was on. Harold pulled the cart across the playground as the toilets zipped after them. "Fire one!" cried Captain Underpants. George shot a glob of creamed chipped beef into the first toilet's mouth. The toilet swallowed it whole. Harold kept pulling as George scooped another serving into the underwear and pulled it back. "Fire two!" cried Captain Underpants. Zip went the cafeteria food right into the second toilet's mouth. The whole process repeated itself until every last toilet had swallowed at least 2 servings of creamed chipped beef. "We're almost out of ammo," Captain Underpants shouted. "And I don't think I can run any more," said Harold, huffing and puffing. "Don't worry, look," said George, pointing at the toilets. They had all slowed down and were beginning to groan and wobble around. Their eyes crossed and they turned an odd shade of green. "Look out!" cried Harold. "I think they're going to hurl." And that's just what they did. George, Harold, and Captain Underpants watched as the toilets upchucked everything they had eaten during the day. The cream chipped beef, the underwear, and even the teachers all came out without a scratch. Then the toilets spun around in small circles and fell to the ground dead. George checked the teachers. "They're alive," he said. "Unconscious, but alive." "Wow," said Harold. "That was easy." "Too easy," said George. "What do you mean?" asked Harold. George pulled a comic book out of his backpack and showed it to Harold. Remember how the Patsy 2000 turned everything on the front cover of our comic book to life? He asked. Yeah, so? Said Harold. Well, said George, as he pointed to the Turbo Toilet 2000 on the front cover of the comic, we haven't seen him yet. Chapter 16, the Turbo Toilet 2000. Suddenly, the Turbo Toilet 2000 came charging out the front door of the school with a terrible crash. The earth rumbled beneath its mighty footsteps, as nearly a ton of twisting steel and raging porcelain descended upon our heroes. You three meddling fools may have destroyed my army of talking toilets, screamed the Turbo Toilet 2000, but you're all out of cafeteria food. How are you going to stop me? I'll tell you how, said Captain Underpants boldly. With wedgie power. Wait, Captain Underpants, cried George. You can't fight that thing. He'll rip you to pieces. Boys, said Captain Underpants nobly, I must fight violently for trust, truth, justice, and all that is pre-shrunk and cottony. Captain Underpants leaped into the Turbo Toilet 2000, and the battle began. I sure hope this doesn't lead to extremely graphic violence, said Harold. Me too, said George. Chapter 17, the extremely graphic violence, chapter part 1, in Fliporama. Warning, the following chapter contains intense scenes showing a man in his underwear battling a giant toilet. Please do not try this at home. Introducing Fliporama. Here's how it works. In the past, literally dozens of epic novels have been written that have changed the course of history. Moby Dick, Gone with the Wind, and of course, Captain Underpants and the Attack of the Talking Toilets. The only difference between our novel and those other Brand X novels is that ours is the only one that cares enough to bring you the latest in cheesy animation technology. Step 1. Place your left hand inside the dotted lines marked left hand here and hold the book flat. Step 2. Grasp the right hand page with your right thumb and index finger inside the dotted lines marked right thumb here. And step 3. Now quickly flip the right hand page back and forth until the picture appears to be animated. Alright, so right thumb here, left hand here. We'll do it. We'll do that. Flip back and forth. There you can see it move. Alright. Alright, so that one. The ones they can see just that big thing. All of those. Okay. Alright.
You're about.
Okay.
You wanna? Yeah. Flip down. Alright. Do you want to stop? Okay. Alright. Thank you, Miss Sharon.
Okay. Harold and the purple ballpoint pen. Everything seemed hopeless. Captain Underpants had slipped and fallen into the mouth of the Turbo Toilet 2000, and now the giant toilet was coming after George and Harold. Ha 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 ha! Laughed the powerful porcelain predator. Once I have eaten you two kids up, I will take over the world. Not if we have anything to say about it, yelled George. George and Harold ran into the school and locked the door behind them. The Turbo Toilet 2000 banged against the door with its fists, shouting, "You boys can't hide in there forever." George and Harold ran to the gym. "I've got a plan," said George. "We need to invent a character who can defeat a giant robot toilet." "How about a giant robot urinal?" asked Harold. "We can call it the Urinator." "No way," said George. "They'll never let us get away with that in a children's book. We're skating on thin ice as it is." "All right," said Harold. "How about a giant plunger robot? He can carry a really big plunger and—" "That's it!" cried George. So Harold took out his purple ballpoint pen and began to draw. "Give him laser eyes," said George. "All right," said Harold. "And give him turbo atomic rocket boosters," said George. "Got it," said Harold. "And make him obey our every command," said George. "I'm way ahead of you," said Harold. Harold finished his drawing, and George inspected it carefully. "This just might work," said George. "Yeah," said Harold, "if the Patsy 2000 can hold out." The boys turned and looked at the dented, cracked, and beaten-up machine laying on its side in the corner. George and Harold pushed the Patsy 2000 upright and dusted it off. "Come on, Patsy, old girl," said George. "We really need you now." "Yeah," said Harold. "The fate of the entire planet is in our hands." The incredible robo-plunger. George took Harold's picture and placed it on the screen of the Patsy 2000 and pressed start. The lights around them dimmed as the weary machine began to shake and smoke. Lightning bolts zapped, thunder clapped, and the whole gymnasium shook with photoatomic, transomgobulatory, ectophanotripletzanziptic energy. "Come on, Patsy!" George shouted over the horrible noise. "You can do it, baby!" Finally, a small ding was heard, and the Patsy 2000 coughed up a huge metallic behemoth. It rose up and stood valiantly before George and Harold. It was the incredible robo-plunger. "Hooray!" cried George. "It worked!" "Way to go, Patsy!" Harold cheered. "Now let's get outside and kick some turbo toilet tushy." Chapter 20. The Extremely Graphic Violence Chapter Part 2 in Flip-O-Rama. Notice, the following chapter contains terribly naughty scenes depicting a giant toilet getting its shiny hiney kicked. All toilet violence was carefully monitored by PETT, People for the Ethical Treatment of Toilets. No actual toilets were harmed during the making of this chapter. Flip-O-Rama 4. Remember, flip only page 113. While you are flipping, be sure you can see the picture on page 113 and the one on page 115. If you flip quickly, the two pictures will start to look like one animated picture. Don't forget to add your own sound effects. So can you flip it back and forth? There we go. Flip-O-Rama 5. Remember, flip only page 117. So we're going to go ahead and flip it. The incredible robo-plunger kicks the TT2000's tushy. Oh, look at that. He's kicking his tushy. The incredible robo-plunger kicks the TT2000's tushy. Flip-O-Rama 6. The TT2000 takes the plunge. Flip, 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 flip. The aftermath. The incredible robo-plunger had defeated the evil Turbo Toilet 2000, but George and Harold's problems weren't over yet. They reached into the crumpled mouth of the TT2000 and pulled out their principal. "What happened here?" cried Mr. Krupp. "The school has been destroyed. The teachers are all unconscious, and I'm standing here in my underwear." "Uh-oh," Harold whispered. "Captain Underpants must have gotten toilet water on his head. He's turned back into Principal Krupp." George took Mr. Krupp's clothes and hair out of his backpack and handed them to him. "I'm ruined," Principal Krupp whined as he dressed himself. "I'm going to be held responsible for this mess. I'm going to lose my job." "Maybe not," said George. "We can fix everything and clean up this whole mess." "Yeah," said Harold, "but it'll cost you." "Cost me what?" asked Mr. Krupp. "Well," said George, "we'd like you to cancel our detention and our suspension. And we'd also like to be principals for the day." "All right," said Mr. Krupp. "If you can really fix everything, you've got a deal." George and Harold turned and spoke to the incredible robo-plunger. "All right, robo-guy," said George. "Make yourself useful and pick up all this mess." "Yeah, and fix up the school, too," said Harold. "Use your laser eyes to repair all the broken windows and stuff." "And when you're done," said George, "take all the evidence and fly it up to Uranus." "And don't come back," said Harold. To make a long story short, Chapter 22, the robot obeyed. Chapter 23, After the Aftermath. The incredible robo-plunger soared off into space just as the teachers began to regain consciousness. "I just had the strangest dream," said Ms. Ribble.
It was all about these evil toilets who wanted to take over the world. We had the same dream too, said the other teachers. Well, said Mr. Krupp, things turned out all right after all. Not quite, said George. It's payback time. Chapter 24, Principles for the Day, or the Invention, Convention, Detention, Suspension Prevention. Attention students, said George over the intercom the following day. This is Principal George. You are all excused from classes today. There will be no homework or tests, and everybody gets an A+ for the day. That's right, said Principal Harold. Also, we are hosting an all-day recess outside, complete with free pizza, French fries, cotton candy, and a live DJ. Now go outside and play. Principal George and Principal Harold strolled out to the playground to behold their glorious domain. George got a slice of pepperoni pizza, while Harold made himself a banana split at the all-you-can-eat ice cream sundae bar. It's good to be the principal, said George. Yep, said Harold. I wish we could be principals every day. Later, George and Harold paid a visit to the unfortunate folks who were spending the day writing sentences in the detention room. All the teachers were there, along with Mr. Krupp and Melvin Sneedley. Mr. Krupp looked out the window at the all-day recess celebration going on outside. How are you boys going to pay for all that ice cream and pizza? Oh, we sold some stuff, said Harold. What did you sell? Asked Mr. Krupp. Your antique walnut desk and leather chair, said George, and all the furniture in the teacher's lounge. What? Screamed Mr. Krupp. I think we'd better leave now, said Harold. George and Harold left the detention room in a hurry. Miss Anthrop snapped her fingers at them. Come back here right now, she yelled. Uh-oh, said George. Did Miss Anthrop just snap her fingers? Within seconds, Mr. Krupp dashed out of the detention room and ran down the hallway toward his office. He had a goofy, heroic, all too familiar-looking smile on his face. Oh, no, cried Harold. Here we go again, said George. Tra-la-la! The end. Okay, we're going to switch to another book. Okay, so I'll give you that one. Next book is going to be Captain Underpants and The Revolting Revenge of the Radioactive Robo-Boxers. Okay. Help! The world is in big, big trouble. Maybe the comic book on the next page will help to straighten things out. The top secret truth about Captain Underpants. Once upon a time, there was two cool kids named Harold and George. We the boss daddies. Me too. They had a really mean principal named Mr. Krupp. Blah, 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 blah. One day they hypnotized him. You will obey us. Okay. They made him believe he was a superhero. You are now Captain Underpants. Okay. It was funny at first. Tra-la-la. Ha 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 ha. But then Mr. Krupp jumped out the window. Wait! Mr. Krupp really thought he was Captain Underpants. He got in lots of trouble. Come back, Bob. No way, I'm a hero. One time, a big monster attacked the school. Roar! It tried to eat up Mr. Krupp. George found some superpower juice in a UFO. Drink up, bub. Then Mr. Krupp got superpowers. Now he can even fly and stuff. Tra-la-la! The worst part is whenever Mr. Krupp hears somebody snap their fingers, snap, he turns into Captain Underpants. And whenever Captain Underpants gets water on his head, he turns back into Mr. Krupp. Blah, blah, blah. So anyways, in our last adventure, there was an evil guy named Dippy Tinkle Trousers. That's me. He built a big robo suit, then he climbed inside. I'm going to destroy Captain Underpants. Oh yeah, they got in a big fight. Behold my ice ray. Miss me, zip, zip, zip. Tippy accidentally froze his feet to the ground. Oh no, my feet are frozen. Ha ha ha. Clank! Rats, you break my robot! But Tippy Robot's pants was also a time machine. I'm going to escape by going back in time. Oh no! Tippy Robopants went back in time 5 years ago. But some bullies saw the Robopants and got us scared. Yeah! They got so scared they all went bonkers. Doi doi! Goo goo gaga! Bigo boom boom! Mr. Krupp got blamed for the whole thing. You're fired, said the superintendent. I'm a victim of circumstance. Now the future is changed. Everything's different. Since Mr. Krupp got fired 5 years ago, why me? He never got hypnotized by George and Harold. Since Mr. Krupp didn't get hypnotized, he never turned into Captain Underpants. Since Captain Underpants doesn't exist, who's that? He wasn't there to save the world. Who will save us? It's me. Tippy realized his mistake whenever he came back to the present. Oh no, the world got destroyed, all because I scared those bullies. Tippy vowed to make things right. I will fix this mess. But then, uh-oh. Stomp! Who will save us now? Chapter 1. George and Harold. This is George Beard and Harold Hutchins. George is the giant zombie nerd on the left with the tie and the flat top. Harold is the giant zombie nerd on the right with the t-shirt and the bad haircut. Remember that now. If you read our last adventure, you may recall the final terrifying scene where Tippy Trinkletrousers ended up cowering beneath the gigantic foot of zombie nerd Harold. You were probably horrified when the supersized shoe slammed down to the ground, leaving behind a squishy red stain. You may even have commented on the surprising inappropriateness of such a murderous and bloody scene appearing in a children's book. It's fun to feel offended, isn't it? Unfortunately, I'm sorry to have to tell you that there was no murder at the end of the last book. There wasn't even any blood. What happened at the end of our last story is something called misdirection. It's what happens when you are led to believe that something is true, but in reality, it's not true at all. Misdirection happens a lot in real life, especially in politics, history, education, medicine, marketing, science, religion, and the Oprah Winfrey Network. With all that misdirection out there, life can get a little confusing. But don't worry, this epic novel contains no misdirection whatsoever. This legendary tome will explain everything, from our recent narrative complexities to the vast mysteries of our universe. By the time you get to page 210, you'll know it all. You'll be a genius. You'll be smarter than the most brilliant scientists who ever walked the earth. So let's get started, shall we? If you've ever been to the zoo, you might have noticed that really big creatures move kind of slowly. Take elephants, for example. They don't move very fast, even when they're in a hurry. Sure, they might cover a lot of ground, but that's only because they're so big. If you were to shrink an elephant down to the size of a house cat, you'd be shocked at how long it takes for them to get from one place to another. They're so darn slow that it wouldn't be long before somebody changed the story of the tortoise and the hare into the more appropriate, the miniature elephant and the hare. It's the same thing with lunchroom zombie nerds. Sure, they're big and scary and stuff, but they move really slowly. So, if a zombie nerd ever lifts his foot over you with the intent of stopping you into a puddle, don't worry, you actually have a few minutes before you're in any real danger. Tippy found this out the hard way. When zombie nerd Harold lifted his foot above Tippy's head, Tippy screamed in horror. Then Tippy screamed again and again. Then he checked his watch and screamed some more. Finally, Tippy's voice got a little scratchy from all that screaming. So he got up and walked over to one of the few remaining stores on the planet to buy some cherry throat lozenges. While he was there, he purchased a new suit and bow tie, read part of a magazine, and got a foot massage. On his way out of the store, Tippy noticed an extra-large novelty ketchup pack that was on sale, so he bought it and dragged it back to the scene of the crime. Zombie nerd Harold's shoe was still coming down slowly as Tippy placed the extra-large novelty ketchup pack under it and walked away. Tippy climbed back into his robo-pants just as zombie nerd Harold's shoe hit the pavement and crushed the giant novelty ketchup pack. A bright red stain squished out from beneath the zombified shoe as Tippy's robo-pants disappeared in a crackling glow of light. You see, Tippy had mistakenly caused some trouble the last time he had gone back in time, so he had to go back again to undo the damage he had done. But before I can tell you that story, I have to give you this warning. Chapter 2. Let's get serious, folks. Did you ever notice how grown-ups hate it when kids are having fun? Seriously, when was the last time you were doing something fun and some adult came over and made you stop? If you're like most kids, you're probably reading this very book because some adult wanted you to quit playing video games or watching TV. If you don't believe me, try this experiment. Grab a few of your friends, go into the corner of a room, and start goofing around. Make some noise, start laughing and cheering, and maybe shout a woohoo or two. It's been scientifically proven that 89.4% of all grown-ups will drop whatever they're doing and rush over to put a stop to whatever nonsense you're up to. You have to wonder, why are most grown-ups like this? Weren't they ever kids themselves? Didn't they enjoy laughing and cheering and goofing around when they were young? If so, when did they stop? And why? Now, I certainly can't speak for all adults, but I'm going to anyway. I think it's a lot easier for adults to stomp out someone else's fun than it is for them to reflect on their own lives and figure out where it all went so miserably wrong. It's just too depressing for grown-ups to ponder all the decades of compromises, failures, laziness, fear, and regrettable choices that slowly transformed them from running, jumping, laughing, fun-loving kids into grumpy, complaining, calorie-counting, easily offended peace and quiet, demanding grouches. In other words, it's harder to look within yourself than it is to shout, "Hey, you kids, cut that out!" Keeping this in mind, you might not want to smile or laugh while reading this book. When you get to the flip-o-rama parts, I suggest you flip with a bored, disinterested look on your face. Or some adult will probably take this book away from you and make you read Sarah Plain and Tall instead. Don't say I didn't warn you. Chapter 3. Tippy returns again. Tippy Tinkle-Trousers was in big trouble. He had zapped himself back in time 5 years and accidentally frightened 4 bullies. This thoughtless mistake set in motion a series of events that ultimately got Mr. Krupp fired. And since there was no Mr. Krupp, there was no Captain Underpants. And since there was no Captain Underpants, there was nobody to save the world from the terrible devastation caused by the villains from our first 3 epic novels. Tippy decided there was only one thing to do. Go back in time and stop himself from scaring those bullies. But in order to do this, he would have had to go back in time before the last time he went back in time. So Tippy set his Tinkle Time Travelometer for 10 minutes before the last time he had arrived in the past and pressed the "Away we go" button. After several seconds of made-for-television styled effects, Tippy found himself transported to the awful night of the terrifying thunderstorm. Everything looked familiar. He knew at any moment the 4 bullies would come running from the school and tear across the football field. Then they would come face to face with him, well, a slightly younger version of him, and only he could stop it all from happening. Tippy hid behind the side of the school and waited as the wind howled ferociously. Suddenly, a brilliant flash of lightning struck a nearby power line. The electricity in the school went out, and all of the windows became dark. Tippy listened closely and heard the sounds of squealing and slapping and shuffling. It sounded as if a terrible struggle was taking place inside the school. Then suddenly, the back door of the school crashed open, and the 4 petrified bullies shoved their way outside. Quickly, they darted across the football field. This was Tippy's big chance. He aimed his Freezy Beam 4000 at the running delinquents and zapped them all with a mini mountain of molecularly modified ice. The 4 bullies were frozen in place. Tippy scanned the boys with his life systems monitor and found them to be perfectly preserved. The carbonite and Tabana gas-infused ice had been programmed to remain solid for 15 minutes, just long enough for Tippy to do his thing. Quickly, Tippy turned toward the football field, where a ball of blue lightning was growing bigger and bigger. Suddenly, it exploded in a blinding flash! And there, where the ball of lightning had been, was a giant pair of robotic pants. "Boy, that was a close one," said a voice from inside the depths of the newly arrived robo-pants. "Captain Underpants is a lot stronger than I thought." The zipper of the newly arrived robotic trousers opened, and a tiny man peeked out to marvel at the world of 5 years ago. But to his surprise, he saw an identical copy of himself staring straight at him and tapping his gigantic robotic foot impatiently. "Who are you?" asked the newly arrived Tippy. "I'm you," shouted future Tippy. "You from the future." What's going on? Asked Tippy. I'm here to stop you from scaring those kids over there, said future Tippy, pointing at the frozen bullies. Why? Said Tippy. What's so important about those kids? I have no idea, said future Tippy. All I know is I scared those kids when I came back here last time, and apparently it caused a chain reaction that resulted in the total destruction of the earth. More or less. I see, said Tippy. So what do we do now? Future Tippy looked at his watch. Those kids are going to thaw out in 8 minutes and 11 seconds. We've got to be gone by then. So he reached into the cockpit of his RoboPants and grabbed one of his very first inventions, the Shrinky Pig 2000. Tippy aimed it at the younger version of himself and pressed the button. Bzzz! A powerful beam of energy blasted the newly arrived Tippy Tinkle Trousers and his gigantic pair of RoboPants and shrunk them down to the size of a baseball. Big Tippy reached down and picked up the tiny version of himself. What did you do that for? Shouted Tiny Tippy. I can't very well have two of us running around, said Big Tippy. I've got to keep an eye on you. Big Tippy tucked Tiny Tippy into his jacket pocket and checked his watch again. 4 minutes and 16 seconds, he muttered to himself. He looked over at the 4 bullies encased in the now cracking ice mound. Big Tippy turned to his Tinkle Time travelometer and programmed it for a date in the future. Time was running out. The ice around the bullies was disintegrating fast, so Tippy sneaked away to the center of town, pressed his away we go button, and disappeared into a ball of blue lightning. 2 seconds later, the ice mountain that had encased and preserved the bullies disintegrated completely. Without skipping a beat, the 4 frightened friends continued their mad dash away from the school. As they ran across the football field toward their homes, something about Kipper and his friends changed forever. They would never again be the same despicable bullies they once were. Chapter 4, Fixing the Future. Big Tippy had set his Tinkle Time travelometer for a sunny afternoon in October, 4 years in the future. He arrived, as usual, in a giant ball of blue lightning that grew bigger and bigger until it exploded in a blinding flash. What's going on out there? Cried Tiny Tippy. I can't see a thing. Shh! Shushed Big Tippy as he moved Tiny Tippy down into the deep, darkened pockets of his jacket pocket. Big Tippy listened carefully. He heard the voice of a child muttering, "This can't be good." Tippy unzipped the zipper of his RoboPants and peeked out. To his delight, the world looked like it usually did. No destruction, no giant zombie nerds, no moon rocks. Everything seemed pretty normal. "Hey, it's Professor Poopy Pants!" shouted a small boy, whom Tippy recognized immediately. Suddenly, 2 cops standing nearby started to laugh, which angered Tippy. "Stop laughing!" shouted Tippy. "My name is no longer Professor Poopy Pants. I changed it to Tippy Tinkle Trousers." The 2 cops laughed even harder. "And I've got a special surprise for anybody who thinks my new name is funny," said the furious professor. Tippy pressed the button on his Freezy Beam 4000, causing it to rise from the depths of his RoboPants. He set the freeze ray for 20 minutes and zapped the cops, transforming them into frozen statues. "My Freezy Beam 4000 will take care of anybody who stands in my way," said Tippy. "And now," he said with a wicked smile, "it's time for my revenge." "Oh, no!" screamed George. "Here we go again!" screamed Harold. Tippy chased George and Harold and their 2 pets, Sulu and Crackers, through town, zapping his Freezy Beam 4000 at them and laughing maniacally. The chase lasted all afternoon and into the night. The 4 friends hid under buildings, inside trash bins, under bridges, and even down in the sewer. But it didn't matter where they sought refuge because Tippy Tinkle Trousers always found them. By the morning of the next day, our heroes had found a hiding place behind some bushes near the park. "What are we going to do?" whispered George. "There's nowhere else to hide." "I don't know," whispered Harold. George and Harold looked at their 2 pets, shivering with them in the morning mist. "We're not going to make it," whispered George, "but there's no reason that Sulu and Crackers should have to suffer." Harold's eyes began to water. "You're right," he whispered. George and Harold petted their 2 friends sadly as they devised a plan to return to the dinosaur age. We could use the purple potty to take Crackers back home where he found him, said George. Yeah, said Harold, and Sulu could stay there with him. They'll both be safe there. As soon as it was clear, the four friends sneaked away from the bushes and headed for Jerome Horwitz Elementary School, carefully avoiding major streets and intersections. It was almost noon by the time George and Harold and their two pets reached the school. Cautiously, they sneaked through the front door and dashed up the stairs to the library. Hey, Bubs, shouted Mr. Krupp angrily. Where have you kids been? George and Harold looked down and saw Mr. Krupp carrying a large cardboard box. Well, Mr. Krupp shouted, get down here and explain yourselves. George and Harold looked at their two pets and continued running up the stairs. Mr. Krupp was furious. His day hadn't started out very well. For some strange reasons, all the red curtains in his office had been disappearing, and he wasn't happy about it. So Mr. Krupp had driven angrily to the store, bought a replacement box of curtains, started a big fight with the cashier, got a flat tire on the way home, and now his truant students were bringing animals into the school, ignoring his commands, and running up the stairs. You kids get back here, shouted Mr. Krupp as he chased after the four frightened friends. George and Harold and Crackers and Sulu raced to the top of the stairs, dashed into the library, and locked the door behind them. There they beheld their old troublesome nemesis, the purple potty. It was a homemade time machine that had a few quirks, to say the least, and our heroes approached it cautiously. Do you still remember how to use this thing? Asked Harold. Of course, said George. We just used it yesterday morning. All I have to do is set the controller for 65 million years ago, then pull down on the chain. Easy squeezy mac and cheesy. Suddenly, Mr. Krupp reached the library door and struggled with the locked doorknob. The boys heard a shuffling sound, followed by the jingling of keys. Let's boogie, cried George. The four friends climbed into the purple potty, and George closed the door. At that very moment, Mr. Krupp came crashing through the library door with his box of red curtains. He ran to the purple potty and banged on the door. I know you're in there, he screamed. You can't hide from me forever. Hurry, cried Harold, as George fiddled with the controller. We've got to get out of here. I'm working as fast as I can, cried George. Suddenly, a gigantic dark shadow filled the library. Mr. Krupp turned to see a huge robotic pair of trousers at the window. The zipper unzipped, and Tippy Tinkle-Trousers peeked through the cavernous opening. I've got you now, he shouted. Ha! 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 Tippy reached for the button on his Freezy Beam 4000 as Mr. Krupp cowered in terror. At that very moment, George finished setting the controller for 65 million years ago. Then he pulled down on the chain. All at once, there was a brilliant flash of green light, and the purple potty, along with Mr. Krupp and his cardboard box, disappeared into a whirlwind of electrified ozone. Do we have a next person?
Yep.
You gonna do it?
I'm next.
All right.
Thank you, Miss Wendy.
You're welcome.
All right, when last we left, we were about to... All at once, there was a brilliant flash of green light, and the purple potty, along with Mr. Krupp and his cardboard box, disappeared into a whirlwind of electrified ozone. Chapter 5. Tiny Tippy's Tremendous Task. Rats! Screamed Tippy as he watched the purple potty disappear. Those kids have a time machine, and I don't know where they went. What's going on? Cried Tiny Tippy from the depths of Big Tippy's pocket. I can't see a thing. Those kids took off in a time machine, Big Tippy barked at the miniature version of himself, and they took Captain Underpants with them. Where did they go? Asked Tiny Tippy. How should I know? Big Tippy yelled. Hey, I've got an idea, said Tiny Tippy. Why don't I go back in time and find out? Good idea, me, said Big Tippy. He reached down and placed Tiny Tippy in the library. You go back in time 10 minutes and listen to everything they say. Then when I show up, tell me where they went. You got it, said Tiny Tippy. He set his tinkle time travelometer for 10 minutes ago, and in a blue crackling instant, he was gone. Tiny Tippy arrived in the same spot he had left, only it was now 10 minutes earlier. He heard some people running up the stairs, so he decided to hide behind a trash can. Suddenly, George, Harold, and their 2 pets dashed into the room and locked the door behind them. Tiny Tippy watched as the boys tiptoed towards the tall, time-traveling toilet. "Do you still remember how to use this thing?" asked Harold. "Of course," said George. "We just used it yesterday morning. All I have to do is set the controller for 65 million years ago, then pull down on the chain. Easy squeezy mac and cheesy." "Aha," muttered Tiny Tippy. "They're going back in time to the Mesozoic era." Tiny Tippy watched as the 4 friends climbed into the time machine and closed the door. He saw Mr. Krupp crash through the library door and bang on the lavender lavatory. Then he saw himself, the big version of himself, that is, appear at the window. "I've got you now!" shouted Big Tippy. "Ha ha ha ha!" Suddenly, there was a brilliant flash of green light, and the purple putty, along with Mr. Krupp in his cardboard box, disappeared into a whirlwind of electrified ozone. "Rats!" screamed Tippy as he watched the purple putty disappear. "Those kids have a time machine, and I didn't know where they went." "I do," said Tiny Tippy as he stepped out from behind the garbage can. "Who are you?" asked Big Tippy. "I'm Tiny Tippy," said Tiny Tippy. "That's impossible," said Big Tippy. "Tiny Tippy is right here." He reached into his pocket and pulled out the miniature version of himself who had been complaining because he couldn't see a thing. "I'm 10 minutes older than that guy," said Tiny Tippy. "You sent me back in time so I could find out where those kids went to." "Oh, I get it," said Big Tippy. "Good idea, me. So where'd they go?" "They went backwards in time to six